Thomas, Oklahoma, and mongolcentrics like him cosigns Skip Gates and Boochie Bear Brandon. Pan-Africanism strikes back, lies denying Indian slavery and Negroes' Indian blood. Henry Louis Gates Jr. exposed and debunked. Most these weird 5 civilized tribe buffalo soldier victimization Olympics niggas and natives regurgitate William Mcloughlin. With no proof of Indian mistreatment of alleged Africans and skip past the missing years of Indian slavery being bred with Negroes.
And find refuge with their Native American brothers and sisters. They'd sit around the campfire, slapping five and smoking the peace pipe with coachees. Did this happen?
In some cases it happened, but just as often these fugitive slaves were captured by Indians and returned to the planters. And in fact, the colonies had policies. They implemented policies of rewarding Indians who returned fugitive slaves. They might be given 2 guns and a kettle if they brought back a live slave, and half as much if they brought back a dead slave, or rather the 2 ears of a dead slave, which is what they required.
Where's the evidence?
According to Claudio, substantial social contact only occurred in the early colonial era when settlers enslaved Native Americans and African Americans together, and between the Revolution and the Civil War, when a small number of black people were enslaved by the 5 civilized tribes. If this is true, why does every African American I know believe that their grandmother had high cheekbones and straight black hair?
I think it's probably a desire to be associated with people who are portrayed in popular culture as fierce warriors and who resisted the United States. And if you're a slave or an African American living in Jim Crow America, who wouldn't want to be associated with someone like Crazy Horse?
Geronimo and Crazy Horse aren't Indian slaves. Whatever happened to American Indian diaspora slave DNA? Why are they using natives mixed with European DNA coming from the Bering Strait and not Australoid Paleo-Indian DNA to compare to us? Or testing African admixture test on res natives?
Believe me, that's a much better way to function than hating each other. So I called Malefi first thing. I said, Malefi, I just got my results back. I am a Nubian. Where are you from? I am the true African prince. My friend Anthony Appiah, whose uncle was the Asantehene, the king of the Asante people. When Rick Kittle sent me a certificate announcing I was Nubian, Anthony Appiah looked at it and said, "What a ton of rubbish." Now, why would he say that? Well, there's a slight problem with being either Zulu or Nubian if you're African American. You know what the problem is? None of our ancestors who came here in slavery came from South Africa, the Zulu people, or from Nubia. None, 0. Egypt is over here. The slaves came from the area from Senegal down to Angola. 97% of the slaves came from that region, all right? So, you know how long it would take them to walk from Sudan to Senegal or to Angola? It just didn't happen. So, I looked at Anthony and I said, "You're just jealous. Because I am a Nubian prince." I didn't care. I had it framed. I put it up in my living room so everybody could see that I was from royalty. So I didn't think about it. I thought maybe it was strange. Maybe it was on a trade route. You know, there were great Muslim trade routes. You know, today, it's important for the students. In my time, we were taught that the Africans were these benighted people, and they were too stupid to build a boat or to be curious about the world and cross the Sahara Desert. It was rubbish. Africans were just as curious as anybody else. The Sahara Desert was a highway. It wasn't a barrier. So I thought, well, and there were great trade routes. So I thought maybe my Nubian descendant had come over and ended up being tricked by some white man and ended up in Maryland or Virginia or something. So that was cool. And if I needed an interpretation, believe me, I could have produced one. So, and by the way, you know, the Zulu thing, when Oprah was finally in the first series and we gave her a DNA test, basically the next day she went to South Africa to announce that she was opening what became the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy. She was in an auditorium like 75,000 people or something, and she announced that she just had the test and that she was Zulu. So it broke on CNN. I was sitting in my living room minding my own business and said, Oprah Winfrey's a Zulu. I called Rick Kittles, and I said, Rick, did you tell Oprah she was a Zulu? He goes, no, man, she made that up herself. It's a true story. It's a true story. I would lie to make you laugh, but I'm telling you a true story. So I said, Rick, are you in your lab? He said, yeah. I said, is anybody there? He said, no. I said, when the results come in, make her Zulu, man. You know? I said, you back there making it up anyway. Nobody believe you could take some spit and figure out a tribe? What are you, crazy? So anyway, I was a Nubian and it was cool. Well, here's the miracle, one of the many miracles, thank God, that happened in my life. In these series, I found the big three myths of African-American genealogy. The first one is that I am descended from an Igbo princess, and she was so beautiful that her foot never touched the sordid soil of slavery. That there was a German count walking by the shipyard, the docks in Charleston, and he looked over and saw my great-great-grandmother and said, man, she is fine. That is my Igbo princess. And he goes and he buys her and makes her his wife, and they live happily ever after. It never happened. Never happened. And Malcolm Gladwell, I was on Martha's Vineyard a couple times. He said, we were never slaves. So get point number two, because my great-great-grandmother was an Igbo princess. And there was a German walking by, and he bought it. I go, oh, really? And the next day, and I told her that was true. She got very angry at me, so I decided to be cool about how I told people that they were believing myths. The next day, Malcolm Gladwell was in my last series, Face of America. I called him, and I said, Malcolm, would you be in my new series? He said, yeah. And I said, how far can you trace your ancestry? He said, oh, man, I'm so glad I got somebody to tell. You know, we found out I'm descended from an Igbo princess. I go, yeah, I heard that story.
Between 1616 and 1618, which was even before the Pilgrims came, it was of European origin, brought here by fishermen and explorers before the Pilgrims came.
It's quite clear that from the first arrival, from the first time that Africans set foot in the Americas, they were intermingling with Native Americans. And the interaction continued, obviously, all the way through Indian removal, and even thereafter, those Indians who stayed in the Southeast were mingling with African Americans.
Gates' pseudo claim, Negroes had no Indian DNA, Indians never saw Bantus, to have sex with and to cover his lie said Igbo princess crap, but contradicts himself saying in the colonial and antebellum period they were. Boochie said, natives were graping Africans like whites.
Even John Hope Franklin, at most, counted 50,000. And that includes people who would just run down to the swamp, hide out for the night, and then come back. You know, it was hard to run away to the north. There were not millions of black people on the Underground Railroad. We tend to think of the Underground Railroad like Penn Station or Grand Central Station. It wasn't like that.
You know, it was hard to run away to the north. There were not millions of black people on the Underground Railroad. We tend to think of the Underground Railroad like Penn Station or Grand Central Station. It wasn't like that. It was
hard to run away to the north. There were not millions of black people on the Underground Railroad. We tend to think of the Underground Railroad like Penn Station or Grand Central Station. It wasn't like that. It was incredibly difficult to escape from slavery. And as you know, Mr. Black, many of the free Negroes stayed in the South. Do you know in the 1860 census, there were 440,000 about free Negroes. I mentioned that earlier. More than half lived in the states that were the Confederacy and the border states where slavery was free.